Millionaire flaunts mistress at Gala. The plain ex-wife arrives with her billionaire husband's shoes gleamed, and at his arm clung a woman nearly half his age, Sabrina. Her dress was crimson, cut daringly low at the back, and she wore diamonds that reflected the lights like fire. She smiled with a confidence that didn't quite hide her nervousness. She was here to be shown off, to be a symbol of Edward's victory over his past. The crowd noticed instantly. Heads turned, conversations paused. A man whispered to his wife, "That's Carmichael, and that must be the new woman." Another chuckled, "He wasted no time after divorcing the plain one." Laughter rippled quietly, and Edward's chest swelled with pride. This was exactly what he wanted: to be seen, to be envied, to be remembered as the man who always traded up. "Smile, darling," Edward whispered into Sabrina's ear as they descended the steps into the ballroom. "Tonight, the world will know who you belong to." She obeyed, curling her lips into a radiant smile, but her fingers tightened on his arm. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her. Though she enjoyed the attention, there was also the sting of being paraded like a possession. Yet Edward didn't notice. His eyes scanned the room, searching for faces that once doubted him. Edward carried with him a shadow, the memory of Clara. He had called her plain, unremarkable, a burden to his ambitions. He had told himself she wasn't worthy of his name, his wealth, his dreams. And so, he had left her, convinced that without him she would crumble. Tonight, with Sabrina glittering at his side, he intended to prove it. The orchestra swelled, the gala truly beginning, and Edward raised his glass of champagne. To success, he declared loudly to a cluster of investors who gathered around. To beauty and to the future. He kissed Sabrina's cheek deliberately, his lips lingering long enough for the gesture to be noticed by the watching crowd. Yet beneath his polished smile, there was a faint tremor of insecurity. For though he dressed his decision in pride, there lingered a question he never spoke aloud. What if Clara had not crumbled? What if she had risen in ways he could not imagine? The thought haunted him like a ghost, but he drowned it quickly with another sip of champagne. Sabrina leaned closer. "Edward, people are staring too much." "That's the point, my dear," he replied smoothly. "Let them see what I have, what I deserve. Let them remember that I'm untouchable." His voice sharpened, edged with the arrogance of a man who had built walls around his own fragility. Around them, laughter sparkled, glasses clinked, and fortunes were negotiated with a handshake. But the spotlight, though invisible, remained fixed on Edward. He basked in it like a king who had reclaimed his throne. He looked around, waiting, almost anticipating, for the one presence that could complete his triumph, the sight of Clara in her absence. He wanted whispers of pity, murmurs that confirmed she was gone, irrelevant, erased from his world. But fate was patient. Tonight, she was not yet in the room. Tonight, Edward's pride danced unchecked, blind to the storm that waited quietly on the horizon. As the evening moved forward, Sabrina felt the strain of her role. A wealthy matron approached with a sly smile. "Edward, what a dazzling companion you brought. Quite different from your first wife." The words dripped like poison wrapped in honey. Sabrina stiffened, her cheeks burning, but Edward only laughed, his laughter booming, carrying over the music. "Yes, quite different," he agreed, the cruelty in his tone so subtle that only those who knew the story of Clara caught its edge. "Life has a way of giving second chances, doesn't it?" The matron arched her brows, murmured a polite farewell, and moved on, but the whisper spread quickly. Every table, every circle of conversation began to turn toward Edward, repeating his words, reshaping them, adding details. It was exactly what he craved: attention, recognition, envy. He thrived on it like a starving man feasting. Sabrina's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. "Do they always talk like this about Clara?" she asked softly. Edward's eyes hardened. "Forget her. Tonight is about us. About me. But the mention of her name, even whispered, stirred something restless in the room. Clara, the woman no one expected to see again. Her absence was a presence all its own. And in Edward's prideful declaration, there was irony written in invisible ink, for the night had only begun, and the story he thought he controlled was about to slip through his fingers. The chandeliers glittered, the music swelled, and Edward stood tall, unaware that the grand stage he had chosen for his victory would soon turn into the theater of his greatest humiliation. And so, the gala breathed with expectation. A night meant for pride and spectacle was already heavy with unspoken tension. Somewhere, beyond the glittering hall, destiny was preparing its entrance, and with it, Clara, the woman he thought he had buried in the shadows of his past. Would you like me to move on and narrate topic 2 in the same immersive way, continuing linearly from this point, so the story flows seamlessly like a film voce discerto? Agora te como narrador y storyteller desenvolva a historia sem marquecos com o nome de cada tópico que for desenvolve. Mi cani sobre o tópico tu com diálogo como seu faz o espectador. Sempre lembrando de desenvolver com vida moco, com vidos sentimentos de forma que a estrutura de narrativa utiliza uma linha temporal linear de modo o espectador sentir o que o personagem está sentindo em inglês. Com 6.000 characters o ChatGPT diz absolutely. Here's the storytelling narration for topic 2. Edward's Pride and the Memory of Clara, written in a linear, immersive, and emotional style, with dialogue and depth, around 6,000 characters. Edward wandered through the crowd with an air of invincibility. Every nod, every polite smile, every whispered compliment fed the illusion that he had it all, the wealth, the charm, the admiration. Yet beneath the tailored black fabric of his tuxedo, his heart thudded unevenly, betraying the carefully constructed confidence. For as much as he tried to drown it in champagne and applause, one ghost clung stubbornly to his mind: Clara. He had not thought of her in months, no years, but tonight, in this hall of glittering mirrors and crystal chandeliers, her absence felt like a shadow pressing against his chest. He remembered the day he had left her, the cold detachment with which he told her that she was plain and unworthy of his future. He had convinced himself then that she would crumble, that the world would turn its back on her as he had. And for a time, he believed he had been right. But what if he hadn't been? He shook the thought away as he maneuvered past clusters of socialites and investors. "Edward, you're dazzling tonight," a woman cooed, running her manicured fingers along the sleeve of his jacket. "And your companion, exquisite." She glanced at Sabrina with an almost predatory curiosity, and Sabrina's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. Edward's pride swelled. "Yes," he said smoothly. "Life rewards those who understand it. And I understand it very well." He offered a courteous nod, the corners of his mouth tilting in a smile that masked the unease he refused to acknowledge. Sabrina's hand brushed against his arm as they passed a long table filled with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Edward, do you ever think about her?" The question froze him mid-step. He forced a laugh, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Her Clara, why would I think about her? That chapter ended long ago." He turned his head, scanning the crowd, willing himself to forget the woman who had once been the center of his world. Tonight is about celebration, not regrets. Yet the memory persisted, vivid and stubborn. He remembered her face on the morning of their divorce, the way her eyes shimmered with hurt, how she bit her lip as if to keep from crying. He had dismissed it then, telling himself that strength was reserved for the winners, the ambitious, the wealthy. And he had moved on, or so he believed. Edward took a slow sip of champagne, letting the cold liquid mask the heat of a recollection that stung more than he cared to admit. He glanced at Sabrina, who smiled dutifully at the attention of their peers, but he sensed her unease. She was young, eager, still learning the ways of wealth and social theater. And unlike Clara, she had no shield against the whispers of the past, no armor built from quiet endurance and resilience. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Look at them," he said, gesturing subtly toward the clusters of guests. "They're all watching. They're all measuring you against me, against what they think you should be." Sabrina tilted her head, uncertain. "Edward, are you saying they'll respect me because I'm with you?" "Yes," he replied with a confident smile, though inside he felt a twinge of unease. "People respect victory. They respect power. And tonight, they see it all in us." But as he said it, the words sounded hollow. For all his calculated moves, Edward could not shake the nagging question that had started the evening's tension. What if Clara had not crumbled as he predicted? What if she had risen in ways he could not foresee? He turned to another guest, a wealthy magnate who had once mocked his ambition. "Everything you see here," Edward said, gesturing around the room, "this is the result of vision. Success does not wait for the indecisive or the weak." "Yes, of course," the man said, raising a glass. "And you've certainly proven forward-thinking pays off." Edward's gaze wandered, almost subconsciously, to the doors at the far end of the hall. He knew she wasn't there yet, but somehow he felt that when she did arrive, the equilibrium of the evening, his carefully orchestrated triumph, would be challenged. And that thought, buried beneath layers of pride, provoked a restless energy that even the glittering lights and clinking crystal could not erase. Sabrina noticed his brief glance. "Edward, you're distracted," she said gently, pressing her hand over his. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing," he replied sharply, too quickly. Then, softer, almost to himself, he muttered, "Nothing at all. Tonight, everything is perfect." But perfection is fragile, Edward realized. Even as he paraded through the room, winning nods, smiles, and whispers of admiration, there was an invisible weight pressing down on him. The memory of the woman he had discarded, the one who had once been his world. Clara had been his past, yes, but tonight, she felt like a presence in the room, even in absence. He laughed aloud, raising his glass to another group of socialites. "To beauty," he said, voice ringing with bravado, "and to those who know how to seize it." Sabrina forced a smile again, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Edward believed he had silenced the shadow of the past, that his pride and wealth were enough to ensure dominance. Yet somewhere deep in his chest, a flicker of doubt ignited, faint but persistent, like embers beneath cold ash. Edward continued through the ballroom, every step precise, every movement controlled, but his mind betrayed him. For all his ostentation, all his careful display of triumph, he could not escape the quiet fear that Clara, the woman he had once deemed plain, might return in a way that would change everything. And so, as the music swelled and laughter sparkled around him, Edward carried his crown of pride with trembling hands, unaware that the night's true spectacle had not yet begun. For fate, like the quiet undercurrent of the gala's grandeur, was already preparing to turn his world upside down. If you want, I can continue with topic 3. Diving straight into Clara's perspective, and the silent struggle she faced after the divorce. Keeping the emotional, the apartment smelled faintly of jasmine from the small plant she kept by the window. It was modest, far from the palaces she had once visited with Edward, but it was hers. Every detail reflected her effort, her patience, her endurance. She placed her keys on the table, sank into the chair, and let herself exhale, a breath she had been holding for years. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Richard. "Are you ready for tonight?" She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. The gala? The same event where Edward would be parading his triumph, his new life, his mistress. Her chest tightened. Part of her wanted to stay home, to hide in the safety of her routine and avoid the confrontation entirely. Yet another part, a deeper, steadier part, urged her forward. She wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She had grown stronger, more confident, more herself. She typed back, "Yes, let's go!" Richard's reply came almost instantly. "I'll be there. Always." The words wrapped around her like a warm cloak, easing the fear that had crept in. Richard had not only given her love, but had reminded her that she was worth more than the cold judgments of the past. He saw her, truly saw her, and in his presence, she had discovered a version of herself she had never allowed to flourish. Hours later, Clara stood in front of the mirror in a gown of deep sapphire, the fabric hugging her frame in a way that felt elegant but not showy. She had styled her hair simply, letting its natural waves frame her face. She applied a hint of makeup, enough to highlight her features, yet not to hide them. She wanted to feel confident, not artificial. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of anticipation, of nerves mixed with excitement. Richard appeared in the doorway, his tailored black suit impeccable, eyes soft with adoration. "You look incredible," he said, his voice low and steady. "Remember, they are not the measure of your worth." She smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I know," she whispered. "It's just him. He'll be there." Richard stepped closer, taking her hand gently. "Then let him see. Let him see who you really are now." The drive to the Gala was quiet, but charged with unspoken anticipation. Clara stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, her mind replaying the years since Edward's betrayal. The sleepless nights, the moments of self-doubt, the endless struggle to rebuild a life she thought had been stolen from her. And yet, through every hardship, she had discovered resilience she hadn't known she possessed. As they arrived at the grand entrance, the valet opened the door, and Clara felt her heart leap, not with fear, but with a strange mixture of curiosity and determination. She was stepping into a room that once symbolized her humiliation, yet tonight it could become the stage of her triumph. They entered the ballroom together. The music swelled, chandeliers glimmered, and the glittering crowd murmured with curiosity. Heads turned, whispers floated like delicate smoke through the air, but Clara walked steadily, her spine straight, her gaze forward. Every step she took was deliberate, a silent declaration: "I am here, and I have endured." Then she saw him, Edward, standing with Sabrina, their laughter filling a circle of onlookers. He radiated arrogance, his chest puffed with pride, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting a hero's welcome. But when he caught sight of Clara, something shifted. His confident smile faltered just a fraction, replaced by a flash of recognition, a memory he had tried to bury. Sabrina noticed it too, a fleeting tremor in Edward's demeanor, and she squeezed his arm. "What is it?" she whispered. "Nothing," he said, though his eyes never left Clara. The words sounded hollow even to him, a fragile shield against the creeping realization that she was no longer the woman he had underestimated. Clara's pulse quickened as she approached, her steps measured, calm, yet loaded with purpose. She could feel the collective gaze of the guests, the curious eyes noting her presence, some surprised, some skeptical, some quietly admiring. Yet she paid them no mind. All that mattered was the man who had once dismissed her, and the woman she had become in the years he thought would destroy her. Edward straightened, sensing the tension rise like a tide around them. "Clara," he said, his voice attempting casual authority, but betraying a tremor of something he could not name. "I didn't expect to see you here." She met his gaze steadily, her voice soft yet firm. "I didn't come to be seen by you, Edward. I came for myself." Richard stepped beside her, his presence calm but commanding. "And you are magnificent," he added quietly, a subtle reassurance that seemed to amplify Clara's own sense of strength. The room seemed to pause, the orchestra's melody fading into the background as all eyes fell on the trio. Clara felt a strange exhilaration, a rush of vindication, not born of malice but of survival, of resilience, of the quiet triumph of a woman who had endured the worst and emerged whole. Edward opened his mouth, perhaps to reclaim control, perhaps to assert superiority, but the words failed him. All he could do was watch, caught between admiration, regret, and a creeping fear he refused to name. The past he had assumed was gone now stood before him, radiant, unbroken, untouchable. Clara took a slow, steadying breath, feeling the fabric of her gown brush softly against her skin, a reminder of the life she had built, quietly and carefully, long after Edward's shadow had receded. She felt Richard's hand at the small of her back, steadying, grounding her as they moved through the crowd. The room's glittering splendor felt different to her now. It was no longer a place of fear or judgment. It was a stage where her strength, cultivated in silence, could finally be witnessed. Richard leaned close, his voice low, caring only for her ears. "Remember why we're here?" he murmured. "Not to play their game, but to show them the truth." Clara nodded, her pulse quickening. The truth: she was no longer the vulnerable, overlooked woman who had been left behind. She had risen, not through ostentation, but through resilience, through building a life that was honest, meaningful, and her own. She noticed the curious glances from the guests, the subtle gasps as they recognized her. Some whispered to their neighbors, voices edged with surprise, and something she could sense but could not name. Pride, admiration, or perhaps the faint acknowledgement of injustice corrected by time. Clara ignored it all. Her eyes, instead, found Edward again, the man who had once defined her entire world with a single cruel judgment. Edward's jaw tightened as he noticed her walking with ease, a serene composure that contrasted sharply with the dramatic display he had orchestrated with Sabrina. "She's changed," he muttered under his breath, unable to stop the admission that tasted bitter on his tongue. Sabrina, sensing the tension, leaned in. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and panic. "Nothing," Edward replied, though the word rang hollow, heavier this time. He had rehearsed control, rehearsed superiority, rehearsed 1,000 ways to appear untouchable, but none of it prepared him for the calm certainty in Clara's gaze. Clara and Richard paused near a group of influential socialites. Richard, ever the subtle tactician, offered a few polite words, his charm understated yet powerful, as if to quietly signal that Clara was no longer alone, that she had someone by her side whose presence amplified her quiet strength. He glanced at Clara, a gentle reminder that she was safe, respected, and admired, not for show, but for the person she had become. A waiter passed by, offering champagne, and Clara accepted a glass, her fingers brushing against the cool crystal. She could feel every eye on her, measuring her, wondering how she had evolved from the woman Edward had dismissed. She raised the glass lightly, almost as a silent toast to the woman she had become. Edward's eyes narrowed. The arrogance he had worn like armor felt thinner now, more fragile. He approached, attempting casual authority, but Clara did not flinch. "Edward," she said softly, her voice steady yet carrying an undeniable gravity. "It's been a long time." "Yes," he replied, his voice tight, a practiced smile masking the storm inside. "Too long, perhaps." Sabrina, noticing Edward's faltering, tugged at his arm. "Don't let her rattle you," she whispered, but Edward barely heard her. All his attention was on Clara, on the way she carried herself with effortless grace, how she seemed untouched by the years of betrayal, untouched by his attempts to diminish her. Clara's eyes flicked briefly to Richard. "Shall we dance?" she asked quietly, a gentle question that carried more weight than it seemed. Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. As they moved toward the dance floor, Clara felt the soft press of his hand, the reassuring warmth that had become a constant in her life. This was more than a man's presence, it was partnership, respect, and unwavering support. The music shifted, the orchestra swelling into a waltz. Clara and Richard glided onto the floor, their movements fluid, commanding, yet intimate. The crowd parted subtly, their gazes fixed not only on the couple's elegance, but on the unspoken story unfolding in every subtle gesture, in every controlled expression. Clara's chin lifted slightly, her eyes calm, her smile composed. She was not performing for Edward. She was performing for herself, and the effect was undeniable. Edward watched, a tight knot of unease forming in his chest. He had always believed his wealth, his charm, and his ability to display power publicly were enough to assert dominance. But here, in the subtle elegance of Clara and the understated strength of Richard, he saw a truth he could not challenge. Clara did not need to flaunt her status, her beauty, or her success. Her confidence alone silenced the room, and him along with it. Sabrina fumed, her cheeks burning as she leaned closer to Edward. What is happening? They're different," Edward muttered, the words tasting foreign and bitter. "She is radiant." Clara felt the tension radiating from Edward, a reminder that she was no longer invisible, no longer diminished. But she did not let that feeling tempt her toward triumphalism. Instead, she let it be a quiet affirmation of her journey, the long nights of rebuilding, the small victories, the courage to find love again with someone who truly valued her. As the dance continued, whispers spread among the guests. "Is that Clara with Richard? She is stunning." Each murmured recognition, each astonished glance, served as subtle vindication, yet Clara did not let it define her. She moved with dignity, with poise, carrying not resentment, but an unspoken message. She had survived, she had risen, and she would not be reduced to the shadow of someone else's past mistakes. Edward finally turned away, his chest tight, mind racing. He had imagined this night as a celebration of his victory, a demonstration of his control over the narrative. But Clara's presence, the quiet assertion of her strength, and the visible support of Richard, dismantled that illusion. Pride alone could not protect him from the truth he now faced. She had flourished, and he had been left behind. Clara, sensing the subtle turmoil she had sparked, kept her gaze forward, her hand lightly clasped in Richard's. The moment was delicate, almost fragile, and yet charged with silent power. She had no need to speak further. The room understood the story in the tension, in the grace, in the quiet, unwavering assertion of a life rebuilt from pain. And as the music swelled and the chandeliers glittered above, Clara finally allowed herself a fleeting smile, not toward Edward, not toward the crowd, but inwardly toward the journey that had brought her here. She had arrived, whole and unshakable, and the world, whether ready or not, had to see it. She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air brush against her face. The invitation in her hand felt heavy, not because of its physical weight, but because of the storm it represented. A simple piece of embossed cardstock, yet it held the power to confront the past, to step into the arena where old wounds could resurface. Clara's fingers tightened around it, as if holding her very courage in place. Richard, standing just behind her, sensed her hesitation. His eyes, calm and unwavering, met hers. "You don't have to go," he said gently, though his tone carried no judgment. "We can stay home. There's no obligation." Clara shook her head, her gaze drifting to the grand doors. "No," she whispered, the word fragile yet resolute. This isn't about him anymore. It's about me. About proving to myself that I've come this far, that I'm not the same person he left behind." Richard smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "Then let's do it together. I'm with you, every step." His reassurance was more than words. It was a shield, a lifeline against the tidal wave of anxiety and memories threatening to pull her under. With one final deep breath, Clara stepped forward, the heels of her shoes clicking against the stone as she crossed the threshold into the glowing hall. The crowd seemed to shimmer around her, a sea of light, fabric, and murmurs. She could feel the weight of every eye, every whisper, pressing against her as she moved forward. The orchestra's strings rose in a soft swell, filling the room with a melody that felt almost too delicate to carry the tension in the air. She could hear the faint hum of voices, polite greetings, but beneath them, she sensed the undercurrent, the curiosity, the intrigue, the subtle anticipation of a story that was about to unfold. Sabrina's laughter rang across the room, high and sharp, drawing Clara's attention to the center of the ballroom. Edward's posture was impeccable, his chest forward, his chin raised, but there was a flicker in his eyes that Clara caught, something unsettled, as though a shadow had passed across his carefully constructed facade. Her pulse quickened. She had rehearsed this moment endlessly in her mind, the calm greeting, the dignified composure. But now that she was here, standing in the same room where she had once felt so small, she realized that nothing could fully prepare her. Every nerve was alive with tension, every heartbeat echoing against the walls like a drumbeat of impending confrontation. Edward noticed her too, of course. His eyes sharpened, scanning her figure, registering the transformation she had undergone. The woman before him was no longer the one he had discarded. She held herself with grace, but there was power in that grace, a quiet authority that demanded acknowledgement even without a word. She's here," Edward muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice carried a tremor he tried desperately to mask. "And she's different." Sabrina glanced at him, confused and increasingly uneasy. "Different how?" she asked, her tone tinged with uncertainty. Edward hesitated, struggling for control. She's remarkable," he admitted, words faltering under the weight of the truth he could not hide. For all his pride, all his carefully crafted arrogance, he recognized it in that moment. He had underestimated her. He had believed she would falter, that she would crumble, that he would always be the one standing taller. But now, confronted with the woman Clara had become, he realized that the past could no longer be rewritten with wealth or display. Clara felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the tension vibrating like a current through the air. She moved closer to Richard, seeking not his protection, but his presence as an anchor to the calm certainty she needed. "Stay close," she murmured, her voice low, almost to herself. "This is going to be interesting." Richard's hand covered hers, firm and reassuring. "Always." As they began to walk further into the room, Clara's eyes swept across the crowd, catching glimpses of recognition, of surprise, of judgment suspended in quiet awe. Some whispered, some stared openly, and some cast curious glances at Edward and Sabrina. The undercurrent of intrigue swelled, wrapping around her like a tangible force. Every step forward was deliberate, a declaration she was here, not as a victim of the past, but as a woman who had reclaimed her narrative. The air felt charged with anticipation. Each breath she took heavy with emotion, fear, excitement, and the thrill of confronting what had once seemed insurmountable. Edward's gaze never left her. Each movement she made seemed to echo in his chest, each glance a reminder of what he had lost. Not just her presence, but the dignity, resilience, and strength he had never valued. Sabrina, meanwhile, grew increasingly tense, sensing the invisible power Clara radiated, a power she could not match with youth or glamour alone. Clara felt a quiet smile tug at the corners of her lips. She did not need to assert dominance, nor did she need to flaunt her triumph. Her presence alone, measured and composed, was enough to shift the balance of the room. And as the orchestra swelled into a crescendo, the space between past and present seemed to contract, preparing the stage for the confrontation that was inevitable. one that promised revelation, tension, and the quiet, undeniable power of a woman who had survived and emerged victorious. Every whispered conversation, every shifting gaze, every heartbeat in the room seemed to converge on her as she approached further, guided by Richard's steady hand. She was ready, not for revenge, not for display, but for acknowledgement of the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. And in that moment, the suspense hung thick in the air. The world, Edward included, was about to witness a transformation they could not ignore, and Clara was at the very center of it. "She's young," someone whispered behind a crystal flute, "and extravagant." Edward smiled tightly, his pride swelling with every sideways glance. "Yes," he whispered to Sabrina, voice low and deliberate. "They're all watching. They're seeing what I have now, what I deserve." Sabrina's grip on his arm tightened as she noticed the subtle stir in the crowd. Do they really admire us?" she asked softly, her voice betraying a flicker of insecurity. "They envy us," Edward corrected, leaning closer so his lips barely brushed her ear. "Admiration is a luxury they'll never feel. Jealousy, that's a feeling we provoke effortlessly." He stepped onto the polished floor of the ballroom with exaggerated grace, letting the cluster of wealthy onlookers take in the image he had painstakingly created. His eyes searched, almost instinctively, for Clara, and then he saw her. She stood across the room, poised beside Richard, her posture straight, her expression calm yet commanding. Her gown of deep sapphire flowed elegantly, her hair framing her face in soft waves, her eyes steady, unflinching. She was nothing like the woman he had abandoned years ago. There was a quiet power in her presence, a silent command that seemed to pull every gaze toward her without effort, without ostentation. Edward's chest tightened. For a moment, the rehearsed arrogance faltered. He had come to the gala expecting triumph, expecting validation, expecting to display the narrative he had long believed in, that he had won, and she had lost. And yet, there she was, radiant, composed, untouchable. Sabrina leaned closer, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Edward, what is it?" she whispered, panic threading her voice. "Nothing," he said too quickly, forcing the words out with a tight smile. But the truth was undeniable. Clara's presence changed the room, redefined the stakes. For all the wealth, all the jewels, all the carefully curated appearances, Edward felt a ripple of unease he had not anticipated. He raised his glass to the crowd, the movement smooth and confident, but his eyes never left Clara. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily over the soft hum of conversation, "allow me to introduce my companion, Sabrina, a woman of remarkable elegance, wouldn't you agree?" Polite applause followed, heads nodding, glasses clinking. But the murmurs continued, softer now, undercurrents of curiosity and speculation. Some noticed the unspoken tension between Edward and Clara, the history vibrating invisibly in the space between them. Sabrina's cheeks flushed as she smiled and offered polite nods, attempting to shine in the limelight. But even her carefully practiced charm could not compete with the magnetic composure Clara exuded effortlessly. Every eye that had glanced at her earlier now returned to Clara, the memory of the plain ex-wife, lingering in the minds of the guests. Edward, sensing the tide shifting, leaned closer to Sabrina, lowering his voice. "See, they are watching us. They are impressed. Our image, is perfect. But she looks different." "What do you mean?" Sabrina asked, a hint of fear creeping into her tone. She's not the woman I left behind," Edward admitted, the words tasting foreign and bitter. She commands attention without trying, without jewels, without show. And his voice faltered, the confession barely above a whisper. I can't control it." Clara, aware of the shift, let her gaze briefly meet Edward's. No malice, no triumph, just recognition, calm, deliberate, composed. "Edward," she said softly, loud enough for him to hear, carrying a weight that seemed to press against his chest. "It's been a long time. I see some things never change." Edward swallowed, the rehearsed words of charm and dominance failing him. "Clara, you look," he faltered again, searching for a phrase that could reassert control, but the one he had always relied on. Superiority, wealth, beauty, felt hollow in comparison to the steady, undeniable presence of the woman before him. The crowd, sensing the tension, leaned in subtly, murmuring, exchanging glances. Every eye in the room seemed drawn to the history that neither Edward nor Clara could fully conceal. Even Sabrina, usually so self-assured, shifted uneasily, realizing that the spotlight she had believed belonged to her was now being quietly stolen by the one person she could not compete with. Edward's jaw tightened, and he straightened his posture, trying to reclaim control. "Shall we dance?" he asked Sabrina, his voice forced, a thin veneer over the panic rising inside him. Sabrina nodded, but she could feel the tremor in his arm, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle faltering of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The audience noticed too, the micro-expressions, the shifting weight, the faltering confidence. Clara watched, steady and composed, feeling the ripple of unease emanate from him. And she did not look away. There was no gloating, no triumph in her expression, only quiet certainty. Every step she had taken to reach this point, every hardship she had endured, every night of rebuilding herself had led to this moment. The power she held now was invisible, but palpable, and Edward, for all his wealth, could not touch it. The orchestra swelled, a crescendo rising as Edward attempted to move, to assert, to dominate, but the space had shifted. Clara's calm presence, Richard's quiet strength, and the subtle acknowledgement of the crowd had tilted the scales. And Edward, the man who had once believed he owned the narrative, realized for the first time that he had miscalculated. The story was no longer his. Sabrina's grip on his arm tightened, fear creeping into her voice. "Edward, she's different." "Yes," he muttered, staring at Clara. "And he could not finish. The words were trapped in his throat, choked by the weight of truth he had tried to avoid for years. Clara's lips curved slightly, a small, controlled smile that did not mock, but acknowledged. She had endured. She had risen. And in that quiet, undeniable presence, she had begun to reclaim the room and the narrative without uttering another word. Edward, still trying to maintain his composure, felt a jolt of panic as he saw her walk in. The rehearsed confidence that had carried him this far began to falter, his chest tightening with a tension he hadn't felt in years. Sabrina noticed the sudden shift, her red gown gleaming under the lights, but even she couldn't mask the unease that crawled along Edward's spine. She's here," Sabrina whispered, her voice tight. "And with him." Edward's eyes locked on Clara, and he swallowed hard, struggling to keep the words of dominance and charm on his lips. "Yes, with Richard," he muttered, the sentence sounding foreign and brittle even to himself. "But it's nothing. We're fine." But he wasn't fine. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the past, the day he had left her, the cruel words, the judgment that had once seemed so absolute. And now, seeing her radiant, composed, and accompanied by a man who treated her with respect and admiration, he felt an unfamiliar sting regret. Clara's gaze swept the room, calm, measured, and aware. She noticed the subtle stir of recognition in the crowd, the whispers that floated around her like invisible threads. "Clara, the ex-wife," someone murmured. "With Richard, but she's radiant," another voice added. "She looks unstoppable." Richard, sensing the undercurrent of attention, offered a reassuring squeeze of her hand. "Let them talk," he said softly. "You are here because you deserve to be." Not because of him, but because of yourself. Clara nodded slightly, a small smile brushing her lips. Yes, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Because of myself. They moved further into the hall, and with every step, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and whispers swelled into a current of speculation. Edward's chest tightened as he realized the illusion he had carefully constructed. His triumph, his display of superiority, his flaunting of Sabrina, was being quietly dismantled by her mere presence. She is different, Edward murmured under his breath, almost to himself. Not the same, she is changed. Sabrina noticed the tremor in his voice. Changed how? She asked, panic seeping in. Edward shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Clara. She is stronger, calmer, more luminous than I ever imagined. And his voice faltered, caught in a knot of pride and fear. I can't control it. Clara felt the silent tension radiating from him, a pulse of uncertainty that had once been his weapon against her. Now it was a revelation, a quiet acknowledgement of what he had underestimated. She didn't smile triumphantly, didn't gloat. She simply held herself steady, letting the power of her calm and composure speak louder than any words could. Richard guided her toward a small cluster of guests, whispering subtle introductions, each gesture measured, understated, and effective. Clara listened politely, engaged gracefully, yet every motion radiated confidence. The crowd, sensing the history between her and Edward, watched intently, every gesture, every glance laden with curiosity. Edward tried to reclaim control, raising a glass and forcing a smile. To elegance, he announced, voice echoing across the room. And to beauty. He glanced at Sabrina, pressing her hand briefly, but his eyes betrayed the unease he could not hide. Clara's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, calm and unwavering. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The message was clear. She had endured, she had risen, and she had arrived, not as someone diminished, but as a woman whole, unshakable, and admired on her own terms. Sabrina's confidence faltered as she realized that the spotlight she had believed belonged to her was subtly shifting. The room's attention had quietly pivoted, drawn to Clara's calm, assured presence. Every gesture, every nod of recognition from the guests underscored the silent truth: Clara was no longer the woman who had once depended on Edward for validation. Edward's jaw tightened. He had expected admiration, control, envy, but instead he felt the first flickers of inadequacy he had not known since his youth. He had planned this night meticulously to assert dominance, to flaunt his conquest, but the moment Clara stepped into the room with Richard, the entire plan seemed fragile, hollow. Why is she here? He muttered under his breath, though his tone carried disbelief more than anger. She's alive, Sabrina whispered, almost reverently, sensing something she could not articulate. And radiant. I've never seen her like this. Edward turned toward her, eyes dark, searching for an answer he could impose, a way to reclaim the narrative. But Clara didn't give him one. Her calm, composed presence said it all. She didn't need to speak to assert her power. She simply existed, fully and undeniably, and the contrast between her quiet strength and Edward's flaunted wealth could not have been more stark. The murmurs in the room grew, whispers weaving a subtle tension around them. She is stunning. With Richard the First didn't expect her to be so poised. And Edward, he looks unsettled. Clara felt a shiver of anticipation, but it was tempered by a deep, steady confidence. She had prepared for this moment in ways Edward could never have imagined, not with displays of wealth or status, but with patience, resilience, and the quiet knowledge that she had reclaimed her life. The orchestra swelled again, a crescendo of strings carrying the rhythm of tension and anticipation. Clara and Richard moved through the crowd, engaging politely, each interaction a subtle declaration of presence, capability, and calm authority. Edward watched, trapped between pride and fear, realizing that for the first time, he was witnessing the outcome of the choices he had made years ago, and it was not the outcome he had anticipated. Clara's lips curved into a controlled smile, just enough to convey serenity and quiet triumph, and she allowed herself a fleeting glance at Edward. Nothing harsh, nothing vengeful, only acknowledgement. The woman he had abandoned had arrived, radiant, composed, and unshakable. And in that moment, the room itself seemed to acknowledge it, the energy shifting subtly, charged with suspense, curiosity, and silent admiration. Every eye in the ballroom was on her now, every whispered question hanging in the air what would happen next, and Clara, with Richard by her side, stepped further into the hall, calm and deliberate, ready to face whatever the evening had in store. Deliberate, measured, a silent assertion of the woman she had become. The whispers of the guests faded into a dull murmur, replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat, loud enough that he feared it might betray him. Every instinct in him screamed to maintain control, to dominate the narrative, but the calm authority in her eyes made him pause. "Clara," he said, his voice attempting casual familiarity, but the words sounded brittle even to his own ears. "It's been a long time." "Yes," she replied, her tone steady, even, but charged with emotion he hadn't anticipated. "A very long time." She didn't step closer, didn't move away. She simply existed, radiating the quiet power that came from years of survival, of rebuilding herself when the world, or he, had tried to break her. Sabrina tugged at his arm, leaning close. "Edward, what's wrong?" Her voice was hushed, fearful, but the tremor she detected in him told her more than she wanted to know. Edward shook his head, forcing a smile. "Nothing," he said, though the word hung hollow in the air. His eyes never left Clara's, and in that gaze, he saw all the things he had tried to bury: resilience, beauty, composure, and a dignity he could never take from her. Clara's lips curved into a small, controlled smile. "I see some things never change," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than Edward had anticipated. "Some people still believe that wealth and charm can hide arrogance and cruelty." Edward's jaw tightened, his chest constricting as if each word she spoke was a blow he could not shield against. "Clara, that's—" he faltered, searching for a defense, for something to reclaim his sense of superiority, but no words came. He had underestimated her, underestimated the quiet strength she had cultivated in the years he had believed would destroy her. Richard stepped subtly closer, a calm presence behind Clara. "She has nothing to prove to you," he said quietly, yet firmly, his gaze meeting Edward's. "She is here for herself. You are just witnessing it." The word struck Edward with an unexpected force. He opened his mouth, tried to respond, but his rehearsed charm, his carefully constructed arrogance, failed him. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, vulnerable, not physically, but in a way that gnawed at his pride. Clara's eyes softened slightly, though her composure remained intact. "Edward," she said, voice steady, "I don't seek your approval. I never did. I came tonight to remind myself of how far I've come, and to live my life without regret, without fear, and without the weight of your judgment." He swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. I didn't expect—" He struggled, not for words, but for control. Every plan, every triumph he had orchestrated, seemed fragile now, meaningless. The reality was undeniable. She had risen above the pain he had inflicted, and she radiated a confidence he could not diminish. Sabrina's grip on his arm tightened as she sensed the invisible shift of power. "Edward, maybe we should—" "No," he interrupted sharply, though it was a weak assertion. He couldn't tear his eyes from Clara, couldn't turn away from the truth that he had ignored for too long. I need to understand this. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm curiosity, the kind that unsettled him even more than anger would have. Understand what, Edward, that I'm happy, that I'm whole, that life goes on even after betrayal. Edward's throat tightened. I thought I knew. I thought... He stopped, unable to finish, each word a reminder of his failures, of the cruelty he had inflicted, and the assumptions he had made about her. She had been plain, unremarkable, someone he could discard without consequence. And now, the truth struck him, she was extraordinary, resilient, radiant, and untouchable. Richard's presence was quiet but unwavering. He stepped slightly forward, not confrontationally, but firmly. She's built something you can't touch, Edward. Something real. And tonight, you're just a witness. Clara inhaled deeply, the steady rise and fall of her chest betraying none of the tension she felt. Her eyes, however, revealed the emotional journey, the quiet hurt of years, the lingering memory of betrayal, the unspoken triumph of survival. Edward, she continued softly, this night isn't about revenge. It's about presence. It's about being who I am, regardless of your judgment. Edward's hands clenched at his sides. He had always believed that control, wealth, and charm could shape the narrative. But here, in the quiet strength of Clara's gaze, he saw a power he could not buy, could not command, could not flaunt. He realized, with a knot of regret twisting deep in his chest, that he had underestimated her in every possible way. Clara's lips lifted in a faint, serene smile. It was not a victory over him, not a punishment, but an acknowledgement she had survived. She had thrived, and she did not need his recognition to affirm her worth. The crowd, sensing the tension, shifted in hushed curiosity. Some eyes were wide with awe, others with disbelief, and whispers rippled across the room. Edward, standing rigid and powerless in his carefully constructed armor of wealth and pride, felt the world tilt beneath him. He had expected to command attention, to assert dominance, but instead, he had been confronted by a woman who embodied everything he had failed to value. Sabrina looked at him, fear and confusion mingling on her face. Edward, what's happening? He could not answer. The words, the control, the charm, all the tools he had wielded for years, felt useless against the quiet, unwavering force that was Clara. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. She simply existed, radiating dignity, resilience, and strength, and it was enough to unbalance him entirely. Clara inhaled again, letting the tension settle into a quiet certainty. I am here, she said softly, each word deliberate, not to prove anything to anyone but myself. And for the first time, Edward, I am truly free. Her declaration hung in the air, a calm but undeniable triumph. Edward's eyes searched hers for weakness, for remnants of the girl he had once known, but all he found was the woman she had become, radiant, composed, and unshakable. Clara! Edward's voice broke slightly, the syllables stretched, uncertain, fragile. I don't understand. You're different. You're... He faltered, grasping at words that could never capture the reality before him. I'm who I always was, Clara said softly, the words deliberate, calm, but carrying a subtle, undeniable power. I just had to find the courage to live without your approval, Edward, without needing it to validate my worth. Edward's jaw tightened, a flash of anger mingled with longing and regret. You don't know what I thought, what I felt, after everything. I know enough, Clara replied, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. I know you left, and I survived. I know you flaunted your triumph, and I rebuilt myself. I know who I am now, and it isn't the woman you thought you could define. Richard stepped subtly closer, positioning himself just behind Clara, a quiet but firm presence. She's not seeking your validation. he said, his tone calm but resolute. "She's here because she's earned every step of this life herself. Not because of your approval, but because she never stopped fighting for it." Edward's eyes flicked to Richard, his pride bristling, a spark of jealousy and unease igniting in his chest. He had always been the center, always in control, and yet here stood a man beside Clara, not dominating, not flaunting, but simply existing as her equal, her partner, her support. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Clara tilted her head slightly, regarding Edward with a mixture of empathy and firm resolve. "Do you see now?" she asked, her tone almost conversational, yet beneath it lay the weight of years of pain, struggle, and triumph. "Do you see that I don't need you to define me?" Edward swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. I thought," he began, then stopped, frustrated by the lack of a way to assert control. He had imagined this confrontation countless times, rehearsed his words, his expressions, his composure, but none of his plans accounted for the calm, unshakable force that Clara now exuded. Sabrina, sensing the shift in the room and Edward's faltering, leaned closer, her voice edged with anxiety. "Edward, maybe we should step away. Maybe no." He cut her off, a note of desperation threading his voice. I need to face this." The admission was involuntary, raw. For all his pride and power, he could not escape the truth radiating from Clara. Clara's lips curved in a subtle, serene smile. "Facing it isn't about me, Edward. It's about recognizing what's real. And what's real is that I'm standing here because I chose to live, to grow, to become stronger than I ever imagined possible." Richard's gaze remained calm but firm, scanning the room subtly, ensuring the space around Clara was unthreatened, controlled, not through dominance, but through silent assurance. He didn't need to speak loudly. His presence alone reinforced the truth Clara carried. She was safe, respected, and undeniable. Edward's chest tightened. Every word Clara spoke, every calm gesture, every glance toward Richard chipped away at the carefully curated persona he had displayed to the world. He had relied on wealth, charm, and arrogance to command attention, but here, in the quiet, composed power of Clara's presence, all his tools felt inadequate. Why do you still radiate that strength?" he asked, his voice low, almost strangled with frustration. How did you survive all those years and—" He stopped, unable to articulate the storm inside him. Clara stepped slightly closer, her eyes softening without losing their unwavering calm. "I survived because I had no choice but to. I rebuilt because I needed a life that was mine, not one dictated by fear or abandonment. And I became stronger not by proving you wrong, but by proving to myself that I could." Edward's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his armor. I never realized," he murmured, a confession that sounded more like a plea than a statement. Richard squeezed Clara's hand lightly, a silent reminder that she had already confronted this, that she had already won the war of self-worth and dignity. "You don't have to answer him," he said softly. "This isn't about proving anything to him." Clara's gaze returned to Edward, steady and clear. "I don't need your recognition, Edward," she said, her voice carrying the quiet weight of truth. "I never did. What I needed was my own courage, my own strength, and that is something you can't take from me, no matter how hard you tried." Edward looked down briefly, the sting of regret flashing across his face. He had believed he held the power, that he could define her story, that flaunting Sabrina and wealth could erase the past. But standing here now, he realized the depth of his miscalculation. Clara had grown beyond him, beyond the narrow cage of his judgment. Sabrina shifted uneasily beside him. "Edward, maybe it's time to accept it," she murmured, but her words sounded tentative, almost fearful. Edward shook his head, though the tension in his body betrayed the truth. he could not deny. I don't know if I can, he whispered, a rare crack in his carefully maintained facade. Clara exhaled softly, a mix of relief and quiet triumph in the gesture. "Then at least see me for who I am now," she said gently, "not the woman you left behind. Look at me, Edward, and understand that I am no longer yours to control, to judge, or to diminish." The words hung in the air, resonating with every person who watched. The room seemed to hold its breath, the soft strings of the orchestra filling the silent spaces between them, the tension palpable, almost electric. Edward could only meet her gaze, wordless. Confronted with the undeniable truth, she had survived, she had risen, and she would not be diminished again. Clara let her gaze linger for a moment, then glanced at Richard. "Shall we?" she asked, the simple question carrying a weight of command and calm authority. Richard smiled, understanding perfectly. "Always," he said, and together they moved forward, composed, confident, leaving Edward to wrestle with the storm of emotions he could no longer control. The crowd, sensing the subtle yet undeniable shift, murmured in awe and curiosity. Clara's quiet triumph did not need fanfare. Her presence, her dignity, and the unwavering support of Richard spoke louder than any display of wealth or status. Edward remained frozen, the reality settling in, bitter yet undeniable. The woman he had once discarded was no longer vulnerable, no longer uncertain. She was radiant, empowered, and untouchable. And the truth, harsh and unyielding, struck him in the pit of his chest. He had lost her, not because of circumstance, but because he had failed to recognize the strength that had always been there. Clara turned slightly, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd, and in that moment, silence rippled outward. It wasn't a complete hush. It was a careful, anticipatory quiet, as if the audience collectively held its breath. She didn't speak immediately. Her presence alone communicated authority, resilience, and unassailable dignity. Then she began, her voice calm but carrying across the space, firm enough to reach the farthest corner of the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," she said, a small, controlled smile touching her lips. "I know many of you are wondering why I am here tonight. Some of you remember me as someone quiet, someone unremarkable, perhaps even someone overlooked." Her eyes found Edward's for a brief, piercing moment, holding it long enough to send a silent message of strength and reclaiming. The murmurs in the room shifted, from polite curiosity to intrigued attention. Clara continued, her tone steady, unwavering. "I am here tonight not to remind anyone of the past, but to show what it means to endure, to rise, and to claim one's life with dignity and courage. Life does not always hand us the stories we expect, and sometimes those we think we have left behind leave a lasting mark. But it is our choice how we respond, how we grow, and how we live from that point forward." Edward's chest tightened with each word. He had imagined many confrontations with Clara, rehearsed countless scenarios where he could assert control, flaunt wealth, or diminish her presence, but none of them accounted for this calm, piercing clarity she now radiated. It was not arrogance. It was not vengeance. It was pure, undeniable power rooted in resilience, in having survived the storm he thought he had created. Sabrina leaned closer to Edward, whispering anxiously, "Edward, she's mesmerizing. Everyone is listening to her. How is this happening?" Edward shook his head, his lips pressed tightly together. I don't know," he admitted, voice low, uncharacteristically uncertain. I thought I had this." Richard's presence behind Clara was quiet but firm, a subtle reinforcement of support without overshadowing her. He didn't speak, didn't assert, but his unwavering calm amplified the message Clara conveyed. She was secure, she was unshakable, and she was in control of herself and the space around her. Clara's gaze drifted to the edges of the crowd, acknowledging friends and strangers alike, each gesture measured, graceful, confident. Tonight is not about proving anything to anyone else, she continued. It is about honoring the strength within ourselves. It is about the courage to face those who doubted us, to stand before the world as we are, whole, resilient, and proud. The tension in the room thickened. Guests leaned forward, captivated, drawn into the story she was telling, not with spectacle, but with presence. Every word resonated, every pause amplified the emotion. Edward felt the subtle currents of admiration, curiosity, and respect coalescing around her, and a pang of regret twisted deep inside him. He realized he had failed to see her value, to recognize the strength she carried silently for years. Clara's eyes found Edward's once more, steady, unwavering. And for those who think wealth or status defines us, she said softly, yet with unmistakable firmness, know this: it is character, courage, and resilience that truly shape a life. And those who dismiss that often fail to recognize it until it is too late. Edward's jaw tightened. He had expected applause for his display of wealth, admiration for his charm, and validation of his ego, but all he received was the undeniable truth staring back at him. Clara's worth had never depended on him, and she now stood radiant, commanding, and untouchable. Sabrina's face paled slightly, realizing that her carefully maintained aura of elegance and dominance had been eclipsed, not by glamour, but by the quiet strength Clara embodied. She shifted nervously, whispering to Edward, She's taking the room? Yes, Edward murmured the word bitter. And I didn't see it coming. Clara's lips curved into a faint, serene smile, acknowledging the tension without gloating. I am grateful for every challenge, every heartbreak, and every obstacle, she said softly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of lived experience. Because they have led me here to this moment, and to a life I can proudly call my own. The crowd responded with a ripple of applause, subtle yet genuine, their attention wholly captivated by the woman who had once been overlooked. Every eye turned toward her, sensing the quiet triumph, the dignity, and the unassailable presence that radiated from someone who had endured and emerged stronger than any display of wealth or status could mimic. Edward felt the sting of recognition, bitter and undeniable. He had flaunted his mistress, his wealth, and his supposed triumphs, expecting to assert dominance, yet all of it felt hollow against the quiet, radiant reality of Clara's life. She had survived, she had thrived, and she did not need his approval, or anyone else's, to assert her worth. Richard stepped slightly closer to her, hand gently touching her back. His presence was reassuring, protective, but never overbearing. You are extraordinary, he whispered quietly, just for her ears. And they see it too. Clara exhaled softly, the tension easing, but her posture never faltered. I know, she said, voice low but resolute. And that is enough. Edward stood rooted, unable to respond, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in the quiet power she wielded. For the first time, he truly understood control, wealth, charm. None of it mattered against the calm, unwavering strength of a woman who had reclaimed herself. The room remained captivated, the subtle applause growing, whispers spreading, and the collective sense of awe building. Clara had not needed to raise her voice or flaunt riches. Her mere presence, her dignity, and the calm authority she exuded commanded the room entirely. And Edward, for all his years of pride and manipulation, realized with an ache of regret that he had lost her, not to someone else, but to time, resilience, and the undeniable truth of who she had become. I know, Edward muttered, though his voice sounded hollow, even to himself. His mind raced, searching for a strategy, a way to reclaim dominance without revealing the vulnerability clawing at him. We need to draw attention back. Something bold. Sabrina's eyes sparkled with a mix of fear and excitement. Then let's show them who you are. Let them see the power you hold, your wealth, your influence. This is our moment to She trailed off, sensing the hesitation in him. Edward shook his head slightly, trying to regain composure. No, not like that. Subtle. Strategic. They need to feel the weight of me, not just see it. He straightened his shoulders, the practiced smile returning for a fraction of a second. But it faltered almost immediately under the memory of Clara's calm, piercing gaze. He raised his glass, the movement deliberate, calculated. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice smooth but forced. I hope you are enjoying this exquisite evening. Such elegance, such beauty, and such company. It reminds us that success is not just in wealth, but in refinement, in taste, in presentation. His eyes flicked toward Clara, trying to catch her off guard, to reclaim some of the attention she had effortlessly seized. Clara didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze soft but unwavering, and for a moment, Edward felt the invisible current of power she wielded pressing down on him. He realized he was not the storm here. He was a ripple against her calm, controlled tide. Sabrina nudged him lightly, whispering, Try talking to them about your latest venture, your philanthropy, something impressive. Edward's lips tightened, eyes narrowing slightly, as he struggled to find a foothold in the shifting dynamic. Yes, he said under his breath, almost to himself. Something undeniable. He began to speak, his words flowing with the smooth cadence he had practiced countless times. As many of you know, my recent projects have transformed several industries, from real estate to international markets. But as he spoke, he noticed the subtle shifts in the crowd. Eyes that had once followed him now flickered toward Clara, drawn to the quiet authority she radiated. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that his words, polished though they were, lacked the gravity she naturally commanded. Clara, sensing his attempt to reclaim attention, simply turned slightly toward the crowd, her presence magnetic, commanding without effort. Success, she said softly, almost conversationally, yet audible enough to draw ears, is measured not only by wealth or influence, but by the ability to overcome hardship with dignity and grace. Those who have faced challenges and emerged stronger, they carry a power no display of money can imitate. A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Edward felt the sting of recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that her words struck deeper than any speech he could deliver. He tried again, forcing his charm, raising his voice slightly to reclaim dominance. And of course, strategic vision, calculated risks. These are what create true impact in the world. Sabrina's hand tightened on his arm. You're losing them, she whispered, panic threading her voice. Even your influence isn't enough. Edward's chest constricted. He had spent years shaping perceptions, crafting appearances, and mastering control, yet here, in Clara's presence, all of it seemed meaningless. Every gesture, every word, every ounce of calculated charm was eclipsed by her simple, quiet command of reality. Richard, subtly positioning himself behind Clara, caught Edward's gaze for a fleeting moment. There was no aggression, no challenge, only calm assurance, a silent assertion that Clara's strength was supported, unshakable, and undeniable. Edward realized, with a pang of bitter clarity, that no display, no attempt at flaunting wealth or power could pierce the quiet confidence of the life Clara had built for herself. Clara's voice, soft but deliberate, floated through the room again. Tonight, we witness many forms of success, many forms of presentation, but true strength is quieter. It does not demand attention. It commands respect naturally, through integrity, resilience, and the courage to face the past without fear. The crowd leaned in subtly, murmuring among themselves, eyes darting between Edward's forced composure and Clara's serene authority. He could feel the tide of attention slipping irrevocably, the whispers a tangible acknowledgement that she was no longer the woman who could be diminished or controlled. Sabrina tugged again, almost pleading. Edward, maybe you should stop trying. It's only making it worse. Edward's lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of frustration and awe crossing his face. He realized she was untouchable in ways he had never accounted for, not because she flaunted wealth or status, but because she had survived, grown, and emerged with a dignity that he could not undermine. Clara glanced at Edward one final time, serene and composed, yet with a quiet intensity that cut through the layers of his facade. "I am here," she said softly, yet clearly for all to hear. "Not to compete, not to conquer, but simply to exist fully. And that, I believe, is the most powerful statement one can make." The subtle applause that followed was tinged with awe, admiration, and quiet respect. Edward could feel the shift completely now. The room had collectively acknowledged her strength, her presence, and her authority. He could try to maneuver, to reclaim, to assert, but every attempt now felt hollow, unconvincing, and inadequate. Sabrina's face reflected the growing panic he felt inside. "Edward, it's over," she whispered, almost incredulously. Edward's jaw tightened, and for the first time in years, he was silent, stripped of his usual tools of control. He watched Clara move through the room, graceful, composed, and undeniably magnetic. Every glance she received, every whispered remark, was a testament to the truth he had been too blind to see. She had survived, she had thrived, and she no longer needed him, or his approval, to shine. And in that moment, Edward understood, fully and bitterly, that the power he had once wielded over her was gone. The room acknowledged it silently. "Clara," he began, voice low but strained, the words carefully measured yet trembling beneath the surface. You've changed. I didn't expect." His confidence faltered, swallowed by the weight of her calm stare. Clara tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You didn't expect me to grow, Edward?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Or did you think the woman you abandoned would simply crumble and disappear?" Edward swallowed hard, trying to steady his pulse. "No, that's not what I meant," he said quickly, though he felt the weakness in his own tone. I just... He stopped, realizing the words he had rehearsed for years were useless now. They could not penetrate the quiet authority she now radiated. Richard shifted subtly, stepping just behind Clara, his presence a calm but undeniable support. Edward noticed, a pang of unease flaring within him. The man was not aggressive, not imposing, yet he carried a quiet certainty, a protective presence that Edward could not challenge. Clara's lips curved in a faint, controlled smile. "You see, Edward," she said, voice even but carrying weight, "I have spent these years learning something you perhaps never understood. Strength is not about dominance, wealth, or control. It is about surviving, rising, and living fully, without needing validation from those who abandoned us." Edward's hands trembled slightly at his sides, an unfamiliar sensation he had not felt in years. I thought," he began, then stopped, the words dying in his throat. Every sentence he tried to form crumbled under the force of her quiet, composed authority. "You thought I would break," Clara continued softly, her voice carrying more accusation than anger. "You thought your absence, your arrogance, your attempts to flaunt your life without me would destroy me." She paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air, each one a mirror to the years of pain he had caused. "But here I am. And not only am I here, I am thriving." Sabrina shifted uneasily, sensing the rising tension. "Edward, maybe you should step back," she murmured, but he ignored her. For the first time in years, he was confronted with a truth he could not manipulate or command. Edward's lips pressed tightly together, as he struggled to find footing. You're radiant," he admitted, voice low, almost involuntarily. I didn't realize you're stronger than I ever imagined." The admission came out fragmented, raw, and unpolished, the kind of vulnerability he rarely exposed. Clara's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but her posture remained steady, unwavering. "Yes, Edward," she said gently. "Stronger than you, stronger than anyone who thought they could define me. And I am free, free of your judgment, free of the need for approval, free of the past." Edward's chest tightened painfully, a wave of regret and helplessness washing over him. He had believed that wealth, charm, and status could command respect, that flaunting his mistress at this very gala would assert his triumph, but instead, he felt powerless. Every gesture, every word, every attempt at dominance was overshadowed by her quiet strength. Richard's presence was subtle but firm, a constant reminder that Clara was no longer alone, that any attempt at intimidation or manipulation would be met with unwavering support. Edward's eyes flicked toward him briefly, the unease growing. He could not challenge this man without exposing his own inadequacy. Clara exhaled softly, a sound almost imperceptible, but weighted with years of pent-up emotion. "I am not here to humiliate you, Edward," she said, voice steady, composed. "I am here to show the world, and perhaps remind you, that life moves on. People grow, they learn, they survive. And sometimes, they rise in ways you never anticipated." Edward swallowed, his throat tight. He had imagined countless confrontations, countless scenarios where he could assert control, flaunt his dominance, or make her feel the absence of his presence, but none of them accounted for the quiet force, the dignity, the radiant authority she now exuded. Sabrina whispered urgently, her voice trembling with desperation. "Edward, what are you going to do? You can't compete with her like this." Edward's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to speak, to command, to reclaim some semblance of power, but the words would not form. He realized, in a way that left him raw and vulnerable, that her life no longer required his input, her presence no longer depended on his approval, and his attempts at dominance were futile. Clara's gaze softened, yet it was unyielding. "I don't need you to believe in me, Edward," she said quietly, yet every word cut through the room with clarity. "I only needed to believe in myself, and that belief has brought me here, stronger, unbroken, and unafraid." Edward's chest ached with the weight of realization. For the first time, he understood the depth of his miscalculation, the magnitude of what he had lost. Not just her presence, but the respect, the admiration, the bond he had taken for granted. And seeing her now, radiant, composed, and unstoppable, he felt the bitter sting of regret settle deep in his chest. Clara exhaled, subtly, calmly, letting the tension linger just long enough for the crowd to sense the gravity of the moment. "This evening," she said, voice clear and resonant, "is not about wealth, power, or control. It is about presence, dignity, and the courage to stand unshaken, even when the past was unkind. And that, Edward, is something you cannot take from me, no matter what you do." Edward remained silent, the words sinking into him with a force he could neither resist nor deny. The crowd sensed the charged silence, the tension radiating between the two of them, captivated by the unspoken narrative unfolding before them. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every quiet pause spoke volumes. Clara had risen, Edward had faltered, and the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. She's incredible," a woman murmured to her companion, her voice soft, but carrying the awe of someone witnessing a rare spectacle. I never expected her to command the room like that." Edward's chest tightened as the words reached him. He glanced around, noticing heads subtly turning toward Clara, eyes lingering on her presence, smiles of admiration flickering across faces. Each whisper, each nod, each small gesture was a silent confirmation she had won, and he had lost. Sabrina tugged at his arm, her voice sharp with anxiety. "Edward, people are talking. Look at them. They're looking at her, not you. You need to do something." Edward's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I can't," he admitted under his breath, the words bitter and raw. He felt exposed in a way he had not experienced in years, stripped of his usual armor of charm and wealth. I can't compete with this. Clara's gaze swept the room again, calm, composed, radiating authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or assert dominance aggressively. Her presence alone demanded attention. She moved slightly, gliding through the crowd with effortless elegance, each step measured, each glance intentional. The whispers followed her like a tide, soft but insistent. A young man nearby whispered to his friend, his eyes wide with awe. She looks like she's always been in charge. It's mesmerizing. How did he ever? Edward's jaw tightened, the question unfinished but fully understood. He had underestimated her. He had thought wealth and status would overshadow her presence, that flaunting a mistress would assert his dominance. Instead, every calculated move, every rehearsed gesture seemed hollow, futile. Sabrina leaned closer, her tone frantic. Edward, maybe you should just leave. Before it gets worse. No, he said sharply, though the firmness in his voice rang hollow even to him. I need to confront this. To understand how she commands attention like this. His gaze returned to Clara, and for the first time, he saw her not as the woman he had abandoned, but as a force in her own right, a presence that could not be diminished by wealth, status, or charm. Clara paused, letting her eyes meet his. Do you see now, Edward? She asked softly, her voice carrying a quiet, undeniable authority. Do you see that I am not diminished, that I am whole, that I am unshaken? Edward swallowed hard, the lump in his throat catching painfully. I see it, he admitted, voice low and strained. I didn't realize. Clara's lips curved slightly, a serene, almost imperceptible smile. You didn't need to realize. You needed to see. And now you do. The crowd, sensing the tension and the power dynamic unfolding, leaned subtly forward, their collective curiosity palpable. Conversations quieted, eyes fixed on the exchange, whispers blending into a hum of anticipation. Clara's composed dominance contrasted sharply with Edward's visible struggle, and the effect was magnetic. A woman in the audience whispered to her companion, I've seen men like him try to dominate rooms, but look at her. She doesn't need to fight for it. She owns it without even trying. Edward felt a bitter pang of envy, regret, and awe all at once. Every whispered comment, every turned head, every glance at Clara chipped away at the illusions of control he had clung to for years. He had relied on appearances, wealth, charm, but against the quiet, radiant authority Clara exuded, none of it mattered. Sabrina's grip on his arm tightened, sensing his internal unraveling. Edward, stop staring. Say something. Do something. I don't know what to say, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Nothing I say will match her presence. Nothing I do can erase what she's become. Richard's hand brushed lightly over Clara's back, a quiet but firm reassurance, a subtle declaration that she was not alone. Edward noticed the gesture, a small detail but powerful, and the realization struck him he had lost not only her, but the unassailable support that now surrounded her, reinforcing her strength and authority. Clara's gaze softened for a moment, then returned to the crowd. This evening, she said, her voice clear, resonant, carrying effortlessly across the room, is a testament to resilience, courage, and the strength to live fully, even after heartbreak. It is not measured by wealth, power, or appearances, but by the ability to face life with integrity, dignity, and self-respect. The murmurs grew louder, a soft, collective applause breaking out, acknowledging her words, her presence, her triumph. Edward's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of recognition settling deep in his chest. He had underestimated her, undervalued her, And now the room bore witness to the undeniable truth: Clara was unstoppable. Sabrina leaned close again, panic threading her voice. "Edward, people are on her side. They're admiring her. What do we do?" Edward shook his head, voice tight, voice trembling with a rare vulnerability. Nothing we can do. She has already won." Clara, sensing the subtle, desperate tension from Edward, allowed herself a small, quiet exhale. "I am not here to fight you, Edward," she said gently, yet every word resonated with the gravity of her presence. "I am here to live my life, to claim my place, and to stand unshaken. And now, everyone can see it too." The crowd, captivated, leaned forward, the tension thick and palpable. Edward felt the invisible weight of every gaze upon him, every subtle gesture acknowledging her triumph. Sabrina's anxious whispers faded into the background as the reality settled, and the woman he had abandoned had not only survived, she had risen, commanding attention, respect, and admiration with a quiet, undeniable power that no display of wealth or manipulation could touch. Edward exhaled, the air leaving his lungs heavy, bitter, and full of realization. He could see it all now: her composed dominance, the crowd's reaction, the subtle support of Richard, all of it forming an unassailable presence he could neither challenge nor diminish. And for the first time, he understood fully and painfully Clara's victory was not about him, or the past, or wealth. It was about her strength, her resilience, and the undeniable force of a life reclaimed. Sabrina leaned in, whispering with forced urgency. "Edward, you have to do something. Show them you're still in control." He shook his head slightly, jaw tight, a low growl escaping him. "Control? There is no control here. Not anymore. She's untouchable. And the crowd, they see it." His eyes flicked back to Clara, who was standing with calm grace, her posture perfect, her gaze sweeping across the room in serene authority. "But I can't let it end like this. I won't." Edward straightened, exhaling sharply as he tried to project his voice, to impose his presence without aggression, without spectacle, something subtle yet commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, the words deliberate, measured, trying to draw attention back to himself without appearing desperate. "While we admire accomplishments and resilience, we must not forget the importance of vision, strategy, and—" He faltered, the words dying in his throat as Clara's gaze locked onto his. She did not move. She did not speak, yet her calm presence undercut every syllable he forced out. Edward's chest tightened, an unfamiliar panic rising. He had spent years controlling situations, commanding attention, yet now he felt the helplessness of a man stripped bare. Clara's voice, soft but precise, cut through the tension, resonating across the crowd. "Edward," she said, her tone gentle yet firm, carrying the authority that made him falter mid-sentence. "Do you see what this moment truly represents?" Edward blinked, swallowing hard. I think I do," he stammered, though the words felt hollow even to him. His rehearsed confidence had crumbled entirely. I can see, but—" Clara took a single step forward, closing the small distance between them, her eyes unwaveringly calm. "It represents truth, Edward. The truth that no wealth, no charm, no display of power can override who we are and what we have become. It represents the life I have built, without you, despite you, and stronger than ever." The crowd sensed the subtle tension, leaning in, captivated by the unspoken confrontation. Edward could feel the eyes on him, the murmurs of curiosity, and the growing admiration for Clara radiating across the room. His chest tightened, a knot of regret and desperation forming as he tried to find footing in a world that had shifted beneath him. You're still so composed," he admitted, voice low, tinged with disbelief and bitter regret. "After everything, after I left you—" His words faltered, unable to capture the storm inside him. Clara's lips curved faintly, the smile serene, but edged with power. "I am composed because I had to be," she said softly. "Because I chose to survive, to grow, to reclaim my life and my dignity. Composure is the armor that comes from knowing you are whole, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise." Edward's hands clenched at his sides. I never realized. I thought I had broken you." The admission,